Hello everyone and welcome to Virtual Charleston. This is the finale of Charleston's micro online celebration marking Small Wonder, the short story festival, in what is for all of us a strange and difficult year, but where short stories continue to give us enormous warmth and succour. So here we are at the Small Wonder Festival at home, and I hope you all enjoy it. Incidentally, if you're interested in any of the books and authors, there are links on the Charleston website, the Small Wonder website, which will take you to all the books and material that you might need. Anyway, welcome to this event. I'm Di Speirs. I'm the books editor at BBC Radio and the returning judge on the BBC National Short Story Award with Cambridge University, and also a returning guest very regularly to Charleston. So I'm really delighted to be here, and today to be joined by Lucy Caldwell, an exquisite writer of short stories, also a novelist and a playwright. But if short stories are your thing, then check out her collection Multitudes and look out for her new collection next year. Lucy's previously been shortlisted for the award twice, in 2012 and in 2019, and she's one of my fellow judges this year. She's also an editor of anthologies, which is a point we may touch on. And I'm really pleased to be joined too by two of our 5 shortlisted writers this year. Azumah Nelson is a writer and photographer from South London, and he's the author of a very powerful and impressive story, Prey. His first novel, Open Water, will be published on both sides of the Atlantic next spring. And Eley Williams is a brilliant wordsmith, a lecturer in creative writing, and she's the author of Scrimshaw, which is, I think, our shortest story ever to reach the shortlist. Her first collection of short stories, Atrib and Other Stories, was published last year, and her first novel, The Liar's Dictionary, is just out. Welcome very much to all of you. Late September has always been synonymous, or has become synonymous for me, with the stubble fields around Firle, the sun sinking over the sloe bushes, and the dahlias in the farmhouse garden at Charleston. I've been coming to the Charleston barn to celebrate short stories and above all the BBC National Short Story Award for a decade and a half now. And while I'm really sad not to be there today, I am really delighted that we can gather like this and celebrate our 15th and arguably one of our very strongest years ever with the loyal and wonderful Small Wonder audience. So hello to everybody. As many of you know, the award was set up because we felt that the short story in Britain was under threat. There were fewer magazines, there were very few anthologies being published. The BBC was one of the last places commissioning short fiction. And how far we've come. The world has changed unimaginably in many ways, as we all know, but one plus has been the revival and the excitement and the variety around the art form that is short fiction. And that is something I think our short story list this year really shows. It's different in style, in form, and in subject matter, but they're all excellent. It does mean, though, that nonetheless, that celebrating excellence and the sheer hard work of the good story remains vital if we're going to keep stories in the public eye and in bookshops. Achieving visibility, let alone a living out of writing short stories, remains really hard. It's an elusive art, it's difficult, and short stories need writing of the highest calibre. So I'm thrilled and delighted that we have a shortlist that soars above that bar, and I can honestly say that at this point any of our 5 may be the ones to carry off the £15,000 on Tuesday the 6th of October, when the award ceremony will be broadcast on Front Row. Meantime, you can hear the stories on BBC Sounds and you can read about them in the Comma Press anthology. Anyway, with no further ado, I'm going to turn now to Lucy and start with you. You've been shortlisted twice for the Short Story Award before, once when you were a really quite young and new writer, and last year for The Children, which was a story I loved about mothers and children, historical and current. I wondered if you could tell me first what being on the shortlist in both cases meant to you and the effect that it's had on your publishing career.
Yes, I've been writing short stories as long as I've been writing, but they never worked. A short story is so hard to write. I have such admiration for Caleb, the start of his writing life, being able to produce a story like Prey, because mine were, there's a poem by Sylvia Plath where she talks about her poems that don't work, and she imagines them in jars, and she says, they smile and smile and smile at me, but still their lungs won't fill and their hearts won't catch. And I felt that I would try to write stories and they just wouldn't work. And I had published, by the time I entered the BBC Award, I had published 2 novels. I'd written several stage plays, monologues, different things. And I just couldn't get short stories to work. And then I wrote one that I thought worked. But I felt sort of too shy to send it to anyone or to send it to my editors at Faber. And so, because the BBC Award was anonymous and because I thought there was no chance of anything happening, I entered it. And it was such a shock then to be shortlisted for it. And it gave me such a huge burst of confidence that I thought this story had worked, but I'd written stories that hadn't worked for years. And it gave me then the confidence to write the stories that became my first collection, Multitudes, and to say to my publisher that I wanted to write a collection. Multitudes is 11 stories, all narrated by girls and young women. And I wrote it concurrent with my first novel that I wrote when I was quite young. It was published when I was 24, 25. And I had this whole draft of stories, and there were about 10 stories in that collection. And often 2 of those are in Multitudes, versions of them. I just couldn't quite let the idea go, but I didn't have enough of the technique, enough of the craft to make them work. And so I kept coming back to them over the years. And as I wrote more, technically, I was able to do more, and I was able to do what I wanted with those stories. But as well as the technique, it was the vote of confidence, and it was the being at an award ceremony alongside Deborah Levy, who also had a short story that year, brilliant story. And it was that feeling, sometimes I think you need someone to give you permission or to tell you you're good enough. And for me, being shortlisted for the first time definitely did that. That was as important as anything.
Well, I'm very pleased and glad that it has that effect. And it has been wonderful seeing how it's given people confidence to say the short story matters alongside the novel and everything else. So I'm very happy about that. So how was it changing sides and becoming a judge? What were your expectations?
I've judged a few prizes for different forms, but this has been one of the most rigorous. The stories, there are dozens and dozens of stories. They're read anonymously, which is rather lovely. The judges this year, because everything was done digitally, at one point we were going to be sent all the stories digitally, and I think a few of us campaigned against that, because I think it's impossible to read everything on screen. Somehow looks the same. I can't edit on screen. I can't read well on screen. And so we had these huge stacks of stories of paper, all of which has been recycled, that would arrive in the post. And we had such rigorous discussions. And what I loved about the award is that to gain a place on the long list, all a story needed was one judge to champion it passionately. Even if none of the rest liked it, even if none of the rest quite saw the point, we had a very broad and open, we wanted every story that even just one judge had loved to have a chance at making the long list. And then it was just a joy, the discussions we had, the seriousness, the dedication, the amount of thought and care that all of the judges had put into discussing all the stories, and just to discussing the balance of stories across the shortlist as well, it made it seem even more implausible that 2 of my stories had, gone through all of those stages. But I've loved it. I've loved being part of the other side.
Yes, I mean, I think it's also interesting because every year you see the sort of zeitgeist, if you like, and there are certain themes. But we all did say right at the beginning that we hoped there would be humour within this. And actually, I think there weren't very many, but the stories that had some humour in them really came through, didn't they? As we can see, there's quite a lot of humour in our final shortlist. There were quite a lot of very serious and quite kind of correct and sort of on point, competent stories, I thought, this year. But the ones that rose to the top were all ones that had much more depth and layering and a tenderness, an emotional connection.
Yeah, that magical thing, that thing that you can't teach, that thing that it needs to be more than the sum of its parts. You know, that Sylvia Plath thing where it just needs to have soul, it needs to be alive. And the stories, a lot of stories, short stories, they tend to be about a tragic event. We were very pleased to see Jan Carson's story, also on the shortlist, which manages to be an entire car journey and a picnic, and the passive aggression between family members about whether their cake is made or bought from M&S. Jan's story is also funny, and Eley's story as well is just a joy. I mean, Eley's story, since I first read that story, I laugh. Sometimes I laugh just thinking about it. And so stories like that are, all the stories have tenderness, they have depth, they have complexity. Caleb's story as well, it has one of my favourite lines of any of our stories. I know we're going to discuss them in more detail, but when the narrator's friends are joking him for, you know, like Einstein lifting girls behind the library, there was so much warmth, so much humour in so many different ways across the stories that we picked. But definitely this year, for anybody watching that's thinking of entering next year, if you can make the judges laugh, I think your story will stand out. It can be a sort of wry humour, it can be a very bleak black humour, it can be laugh out loud funny, but that is definitely one thing that we appreciated.
We also, we were lucky because we came in just before lockdown, so we missed having a rash of last minute pandemic stories, which I think would have probably dated quite quickly as well. So it's going to be interesting seeing what happens next year. Well, let's turn to our writers now. Can I start with you, Caleb? The youngest writer on our list, I think possibly the youngest writer we've ever had on, at 26, and your story, Prey. I know you've written and published in Litro in the past, but you're also a photographer, and I wondered, have you been writing for a long time?
Yeah. I feel like I've been writing seriously in a way since I was about 16 or so. And I think, like Lucy, this is the first short story that I've been proud of. Like I could never get it right. Like the rhythm always didn't feel quite right. That kind of like intangible feeling that emerges from the story as you're reading it, that's woven both into the narrative and the sentences. Like I couldn't quite get that right. And I think with Prey, it started off with the prose poem at the beginning, and the rest of it felt like I was almost transcribing these snapshots, these photographs of these young men in the summer, just trying to find some sort of freedom and reaching towards that in whatever way that could be found.
Yeah, that theme of the places that you can and can't be free as a young man was, you know, one of the threads that runs through it, and is incredibly powerful. I think I was really struck by how many different aspects of life you managed to get in. So you see the boys with their friends, you see them with family, you see them in love, you see the brotherly tenderness between them. That's very, you know, to do that in 4,000 words or whatever, that was really difficult. I mean, technically, I think to get all of that in with such a light touch, it doesn't read like a first story.
Thank you.
You must have, I mean, did you do a lot of editing on it? Was that quite hard?
I wrote the majority of the story within maybe a day and a half, and I kind of just set it to the side for a couple of months and returned to it. And I don't think a huge amount has been lost. I know I'd been thinking about the feeling that runs through the story, that feeling of longing, of desire, which I think is the thing that really pushes the story, whether that's a desire for freedom or a desire to kind of like let go of some sort of grief, or just like for momentary pleasure. And I think that was the thing that I just wanted to keep. So I didn't want to play around with it or touch it too much. The prose poem at the beginning has been shortened a little bit, but otherwise much of the story remains intact from when I first wrote it.
Well, there's lots more, I think, Lucy and I want to ask about it, but shall we hear a bit of it first? And would you like to read from Pray, and maybe you can set up where we are in the story?
Yeah. So in this short section, the brothers have come to the end of a sitting after both their parents have passed away, where relatives will come and pay their respects, and then there will be like a celebration of a sort. And we found them at the end of the day, like both of them quite exhausted and just wondering what to do with each other. That same night, when the guests began to dwindle, I slipped away to our bedroom. The day knocked me flat, and I lay on the bed, gazing at the ceiling, not asleep, but not conscious either, floating in a place so lucid I could feel my body willing itself to live. Oi! Christopher was at the foot of the bed, taking off his black shirt, throwing on a black hoodie. You look mashed, he said. Trust. What are you telling me? You trying to roll? I propped myself up on my elbows, watching as he stepped into the matching tracksuit bottoms. Where? I asked. Out. You're coming anyway, bro. It's just me and you now. He chucked my hoodie at me, and I rose, willing myself on. We bumped the train a few stops from Bellingham to Peckham Rye, nodding at the gate attendant as we pushed through the side gate. Come, Christopher said to me, pulling up his hood as he led me along Rye Lane. We're the wrong age, too young to be adults, too old to be children, but stuck in bodies which implicated us both ways. The street was heaving. At any time of day, this stretch of road was pedestrianised. People on their way to raves and drink-ups, parents leading their tired children to another family function, young women with their hair just done, an older uncle trying to get home. Young men like us with their hoods up for safety, for comfort in the semi-darkness. Raucous laughter as the day begins to stretch into another. Whole groups plotting, trying to figure out if it's worth switching postcodes for a party we're teed in, or something worse might lie in wait. And Christopher and I, making our way around the curve of the road, hoping no one takes exception, hoping if we walk with enough purpose, we might reach our destination. At least that's how I felt. Christopher never appeared scared, always with his chin raised a little higher than mine, his chest puffed, not boastfully, but with a confidence, a conviction, a truth. We continued on, passing Commercial Way and onto Southampton Way, roads our parents would only let us pass in a car. On and on, onto a side road, into an industrial estate, where I heard the crowd before I saw them. Christopher approached a door cut into an enormous shutter and knocked once, twice. The door swung open and we were pulled into a sweatbox. There were 50 or so people in a space for 25, but somehow Christopher pulled me through the crowd to the front, where Paul, Daniel, Eric, and James waited, all blacked out from head to toe, James wearing a beanie hat and a North Face jacket. Aren't you hot, fam? I asked. Aesthetic, innit? He said, as we all embraced each other. How many mics we got? Christopher asked. 2, Eric said, raising a pair of black microphones in hand. All right, calm. Let's go then. Wait, careful tonight, Daniel said. Trevor and them man are here. Christopher's face hardened for a flash, before that smile I know so well returned. He gestured to us for us all to get started. I made towards the crowd, taking 2 small but distinct steps back. Where are you going? Come stand with us, bro. I can't. What do you mean? I didn't know you were doing this tonight. You know I don't have it like you do. Though I was sure I had rhythm, that I could make a sentence curve to my will, this theory was untested in public, and I worried I would flounder under the pressure. Christopher and I would often descend into absurd freestyles on our Sunday afternoons, going back to back, bar for bar, gassing each other when a line would emerge seemingly from nowhere. It would make us stop in wonder, processing the phrase from all angles. But here, I shook my head. Nah. No one's making you step to the mic unless you really want to. I shook my head again. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders and pulled me close so that his lips brushed my ear as he spoke. You're here to be part of this, for the vibe, for the hype. He paused. You're here to enjoy yourself. Shit hasn't been fun of late. This is where I come for a little fun. Can you do that for me? Have some fun. I nodded and we bumped fists. We separated and he flicked the mic on, bringing it to his mouth, calling for attention in the room. Everyone was silent as Christopher introduced himself and our crew. When he told the DJ, posted up on a makeshift table in the far corner of the room, to start spinning, the silence morphed to quiet, which is a different thing altogether and requires a very specific attention. The crowd latched on to Christopher's energy as his tongue danced over sparse instrumentals, heavy with snares and kicks and hi-hats, nothing that would muddy his vocals. He took the time with each syllable, even as he worked himself up, even as it appeared he was careening, matching the crowd's energy, then matching his, this dance accentuated by the nodding of heads, the encouraging shouts in our direction. After the third song, he took a moment. Are you man ready? Christopher addressed the crowd. He turned to us, still speaking into the mic. I don't think they're ready. The crowd protested, pressing forward. They were hungry. Come then, run it up one time. The beat started and knocked me back. The crowd surged forward as the bass rattled our bones, a kick sneaking amongst the rattle of the hi-hats. The snare was so bare it resembled a clap. We're all moving, and I was pulled into the mosh pit, arms and hands and legs swinging. We had relinquished control. We were the words unspoken. We were joyous. We were an ocean that we had chosen to jump into rather than being thrown overboard. I caught a glimpse of Christopher in the moment before he started rapping. He was a man possessed, or rather a man in full possession of himself. He delivered his lyrics with the precision of a poet. We hurt people because we've been hurt too. Because trust me, I don't want to hurt you. And I know when his anger gets loose, it might find a home in your front tooth. And as he took a deep inhale, ready to swing with his next line, the DJ spun the track back, cutting the music. And to the glee of the crowd, Christopher lowered his microphone, taking this all in, grinning.
Thank you so much, Caleb. That was lovely. But it's very, very moving. And I think one of the things I loved most about the story was the tenderness between the two brothers. And you go on shortly after that there's a line that I think is incredibly powerful in the story, saying, in the police and the newspaper reports, they will describe Christopher as though he never had a beginning. And actually what you're doing throughout the story is giving us all his beginnings and the narrators. And I think that care for between the brothers is just really beautifully done there, and that the latent pressure on them. Lucy, and I know you were incredibly impressed by the dialogue in this story as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, and also, Kayla, maybe you can tell us how you managed to write that so well, the dialogue between them?
Yes, that's right. I think the playwright in me especially really values good dialogue, because a story doesn't necessarily need the dialogue to be particularly strong, but too often in stories you see dialogue that is very clunky, that is trying to do a lot of exposition, that's just leaden on the page. And Caleb, his dialogue it just leaps off the page. The rhythms are just perfect. You can just hear it. And he's very good at what people say and what they don't say. He's very good at using dialogue very comically. He'll have a section about the narrator, a quite romantic section about the narrator kissing this girl that he's falling in love with, and then the switch of the way his mates josh him about it is just perfect. And I think that as well, I'm really interested, Caleb, to hear you say how the story was written, because I think you can feel that as well. I quite often think of stories as spells. So rather than being a plot, I think that the rhythm is what's most important, as if you're reciting a spell to create a mood. And often with my stories, especially my teenage stories, what I'm trying to do is to create a particular feeling, a particular sensation. And for me, the key to that is always the rhythm. Even if the story isn't being read out loud, I think you can feel the rhythm as you're reading it on the page. And I think your story does that. It does that with the dialogue. It does that with the beautiful sense of litany that you have at the start with your prey and the repetition. And that helps a story, that sets currents going that just are there through the story. And so I think, although I admired your use of dialogue and your rhythm with the dialogue, I think it's a sign of something deeper that's there throughout the story as a whole. And it makes perfect sense hearing how you wrote that.
Was it difficult to do the dialogue?
I think so. During my university years and just afterwards, I kind of pitched my hand at screenwriting, and so spent a lot of time writing, trying to write good dialogue, and just, I guess, trying to listen. I think this kind of speaks to the point you were making earlier, Di, about just being able to pack so much into this story. I think it's really important for me to give view to kind of the interiority of all of these different people that are involved in this story. And by that I mean like the kind of full range of their like desires and their vulnerabilities and their fears and their joy. And I guess it's really important for me to see people as a photographer, and I guess as a writer, like, it's important for me to hear as well what they are saying and what they're not saying. And so that's really where the dialogue emerges from. Like, when I am writing, it does feel very real to me, because it feels like these could be people with these like kind of real joyous moments, and with these moments in which they're not doing so well. Like I'm really insistent on just seeing people as a whole and as they might want to be seen.
And are there things, I'm interested in that the difference between what you can do visually then as a photographer and what you can do as a writer, and whether there's something about interiority that you can only reach by words rather than with pictures.
I think there's it to the point that Lisa was making about like the mood of something, about a spell of something. So much of my favorite art, be it visual or written, does just always carry a mood. One of my favorite films is Moonlight by Barry Jenkins, in which there isn't a huge amount of plot, but it's more like a tone poem. There's like very clear kind of nods to a feeling with color and the way that it's shot and the dialogue and the repetition of everything. On that point, repetition is really important to me. Throughout Prey and like throughout my novel, like there's constant refrains, because I think I'm always been really interested in the idea of like a loop and what happens when you come back around to the loop, because you can't be the same person or have the same feeling. You're going to experience something different even if the sentence remains the same, because it's framed by different things.
Yes, I want to bring Eley in here. We'll come to your story in a moment, and there's a couple more things I want to ask you, Caleb. But I mean, that idea of how words loop around on each other. I mean, you're such a craftswoman and a wordsmith. Is that something you're very conscious of? Does that chime with you?
Definitely. I mean, I was just scribbling away as you were speaking, Caleb, and like circling the word loop. I think especially short stories provide a space and an opportunity to notice those loops and those connections, and to treat them as tableau, and whether they're scenes or refrains, to use your word, or incantations that form a rhythm within the structure of the short story. So it is a more structural conceit, or for the topic at hand or the characters, whether they're caught in kind of recurrent tics of expression or in behavior or anxieties. I think in a novel, you have to justify or modulate to an extent how far those can be the central conceit of the prose. While with a short story, you are able to zone in and concentrate on a glimpse, on something that could be tiny but has momentum, because you're either trapped by it, or freed by it, or you're provided a kind of rhythmic, as I say, kind of momentum or push forward. So I think as a form, the short story really lends itself to that idea of looping. And it's something that, as you say, with words, I like to play around with the way words can ricochet and mean different things if heard in different ways. Or especially with page-based short stories, the shape of a word even can become a real site of tension.
Oh, I mean, I completely love that in Scrimshaw. I love that idea. I mean, it's probably easier on Zoom to discuss llama and bed, that idea of the two ends of and the plumped up E in the middle being the duvet. But you're very, everything you do with words and your sort of interest in etymologies really shines through all your work, I think, Eley.
That's probably born of anxiety of miscommunicating. So kind of doing something in abundance as a kind of defensive mechanism. But I think that often, I don't know, to write, you are communicating. You're either communicating a fantasy or a lived experience or a metaphor, or all three of those things. And the idea that you're doing that through communication, about communication, is another loop that I enjoy exploring through short stories, and that anxiety can play a part in that, as much as characters and narrators striving to justify their right to express themselves or take up room on a page even.
Yes, a short story, I think, allows for such an intensity of precision that suits your work so particularly. Novel has to be a lot baggier, and I always think of the Kevin Barry phrase where he talks about a short story as a high wire act, and at any moment, any word you can trip, it can go slack, and it's all lost. But I mean, your story, Eley, it's 1,412 words, which is very short, and all of those matter. There's an attention to that precise detail that is possible in the form that I don't think is possible in any other form.
I think that was something we saw in Sarah Hall's story as well, the grotesques. I mean, I don't think there's a word really out of place. That's another story which has got extraordinary layering within it, hasn't it? And the kind of the echoes that she brings back, maybe 3-7 pages on, and it's beautifully constructed, I think, as a piece of writing. Caleb, before we have a listen to Eley's stories, I wanted to ask you one more thing for the moment. You wrote this before George Floyd's death, and you before the kind of the big sort of resurgence, I suppose, of Black Lives Matter this summer. None of these things are new, sadly, and the story is born out of all the things that cause all of that. But I wonder if did it feel that it added weight or gave you a different responsibility, or was it separate? I wondered how it felt when all of that was happening and you were aware your story is another part of that very complicated and difficult jigsaw for people.
Yeah.
A constructive one, I might say.
I think the story was kind of written in the wake of me processing similar deaths to George Floyd that have happened in the past, but often when like these really public deaths, and actually sometimes private, because a lot of these deaths aren't reported so widely, occur, there's a grieving and a mourning that needs to take place, and sometimes that takes days, sometimes that takes weeks, sometimes that takes months, sometimes that takes years. I think in the wake of this, it got me asking the same questions that meant that I wrote this story. It got me asking about this idea of like this enormous structural violence and this global mourning that needs to be done for Black people, and how we find like freedom in different spaces and find ourselves free of that grief and of that mourning, in just like sitting around and playing with your friends, or like going to the music venue, which I think is why the murder of George Floyd was so devastating, because we were all inside and we weren't able to find these moments of respite. And it was just like very, like a constant barrage that you couldn't really disconnect yourself from, because you wanted to be part of the collective of a kind, but also you knew that collective was quite damaging to your health, like mental, physical, spiritual. And so to have this story shortlisted in the wake of that, in a time in which I know that yes, it has risen to like public consciousness, but not a lot has changed, feels really like important to me. It feels very like fundamental in a way.
No, well, I think there's many lines in that story about the boys hoping to reach their destination, and the randomness of it all, I think, which are very telling and important, and I hope will continue to resonate down the readers over the next years. But it's a very timely story, and actually I suppose it's one of the things that this award sometimes throws up, which is that the most resonant and timely stories are not necessarily ones that were written with that hat on, but actually come out of something really deep and that needs to be said. I'm going to move to you, Eley, now for a very different sort of story, and yours in a way also reflects, but arguably does much, well, better is a wrong word perhaps, but does with exceptional agility and grace and pizzazz. Scrimshaw it's very difficult to write really short fiction. It's really hard to put it off. I read quite a lot, and it's lovely, but it doesn't stay with you. And I thought Scrimshaw was a brilliant example of something which had fantastic depth through its tiny, as Lucy says, not much more than 1,000 words. Let's talk about your brilliant tour de force, but perhaps we can hear it first in a slightly but not very trimmed version.
Sure. Let me get it. I mean, there's an irony on me reading it off my phone, which will become obvious.
One of the things I really loved about it was that phones get kind of slammed quite a lot just for being, distractions and things that detract and diminish our lives. And actually, I watch, not only myself, but also younger generations using them, and there's a huge amount of pleasure and enjoyment and connection, and there's lots of incredibly valuable and positive things, and I thought you rather celebrated the fact that a phone can do that. But anyway, all will be revealed.
Let's see, if it suddenly dies halfway, that's it. I'm cutting the phone out. That relationship is over. Okay, and again we were messaging late at night until the early hours of the morning. I pressed my face closer to my phone screen and imagined you doing the same. A whole town stretched between us, and I considered the surface of our separate skins blued or bloon or blues by pixel light as we typed against our own private darknesses. We dispatched small talk, sweet nothings. Then your message said that you were feeling unhappy. We're all feeling unhappy, I thought, but also flushed with responsibility for taking charge of your state of mind. I flexed my thumbs. I couldn't ask you about your day because perhaps that had been the cause of your unhappiness and would just further it. I couldn't tell you about my day because it was the cause of my unhappiness and might exacerbate your own. I couldn't comment on the weather or the politics or the price of either and neither of those things because unhappiness, unhappiness, unhappiness. I kept typing the first letter of possible responses to you, even though I know that this causes 3 rippling dots to appear on your phone screen. These dots change in character, depending on your mood. Ellipses, Hansel and Gretel breadcrumbs, Polyphemus's sockets, the side of a rolled dice. As I trial potential first responder letters, the trailing 3 dots must be shifting minutely on your phone screen. 3 dots, undulating while I dithered, modulating the color of the blue light hitting your face as you waited for my message to materialize. I drafted a breath, then deleted it. The word unhappy implies something of a void, a state of not happiness, sure, but not necessarily one featuring a person in an active participation of despair. I looked up synonyms for unhappiness and wondered where on the scale you might place yourself, if given the option. Cheerlessness, desolation, despair, despondency, dolefulness, downheartedness, gloom, gloominess, glumness, malaise, wretchedness. I would list them to you in alphabetical order like this, so to not imply my own personal hierarchy in terms of the terms. Perhaps best not to dwell on the word unhappiness. You cannot be in control of another person's feelings was a phrase I'd once overheard on a bus. It spoke to me, it resonated, and I thought to save it to the notes on my phone and embolden the text. So, no need to draw attention to your unhappiness by querying it or requesting context. I cannot hope to lance that boil for you without first dragging out descriptions of the boil, handling the boil, prodding the boil, and haranguing it unto carbuncles. And this metaphor has run away with me to the fair. And what I mean is, questions, as with boils, can cause irritation from direct pressure, and over time the inflamed area enlarges. Better then to dwell apart from your unhappiness in my answer. You cannot be in control of another person's feelings. Undwell, antidwell, disdwell, dedwell. I send you a link to an online live feed of walruses. The page was a go-to site for me. I had it bookmarked, ready for whenever insomnia had me in its grip or its jaws or its jar or its spackle. The walrus live feed is maintained by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, with their cameras trained 24/7 on the Walrus Island State Game Sanctuary, one of the largest gathering places in the world for Pacific walruses. Whenever the season is right, at any time of the day or night, you can click onto the live stream and watch 15,000 walruses rolling around and sunning themselves, puffy and hairy and taking stock of their walrus days. There is audio too, which just adds to the charm. Your phone or laptop speakers come alive with their huffing and puffing, mustachioed blurts and blusterings of no-foot, never-footed scuffling. I think of walruses belonging to that subset of animals that are twee but also somehow noble in their anatomical absurdity. They look like they were designed for the purposes of an Edward Lear poem. See also penguins, pelicans, flamingos, koalas. Maybe that's a personal opinion. I should list them to you in alphabetical order so to not imply a hierarchy. Flamingos, koalas, pelicans, penguins, walruses. Walruses look frustrated and benign. I thought that this might be an appropriate response to your unhappiness. I am sorry for your frustrations. You were right to tell me. I can be your technique for distraction. I can never tell if we are flirting, but I can help you. I can distract you, I draft. I delete. I want to drive you to distraction, I try typing. No. ... I love you, I draft in my text message, a word for each dot that must appear on your phone screen. I delete that draft. On idle instinct, I click the link that I set you. I want to check that what was currently taking place at the walrus colony. I could use the distraction too. The page begins to load. Refreshing stream, it reads. Soon, I think. Walruses in a refreshing stream. You have not replied. It has been minutes. Usually you are quicker than this. My phone tells me it's 4:02, which doesn't look like the shape of anything. I check to see what is happening on the live feed of walruses, relieved to see that the page has finally loaded. I would not have wanted to send you a dead link down a dead end. The walruses on my screen are grey and pink. They are brawling. No, they are not brawling. They are roaring as they not brawl. I realise I have sent you a link to a live stream of walruses mating. It is obscenely in high definition, as obscene and absurd as rolling and violent and loafish as 4:02 and a clock face, and I have never been more awake in my life. I wait and wait. The walruses mate on. I draft an apology, then delete, and wait, and I am so unhappy, dejected, wretched. There are no 3 dots from you in answer, not even the beginning of an SOS, because you have fallen asleep, switched your phone off, ceased to exist entirely, all 3. I concentrate on ceasing to exist entirely, but I do not know what you are thinking. We cannot be in control of another person's feelings, but I did not mean to send that to you, and I hope the thrill of error filled your state of not happiness. And know there is a blue glow between my fingers, my fist over my screen, and the sound of braying and lancing, remorseful, like something loud and long and clear.
Thank you. That makes me laugh every time, and I will never look at walruses in the same light. Does that link exist? Can we find that link?
Oh yeah, that's very much there. I suspect I won't be called on as a laureate for their good work, but no, that's definitely a real link.
Yeah. I have this vision of you and your partner, who also happens to have been shortlisted for this award, Nell Stevens, sitting around punning and doing, you know, dictionary games every night together. Is that your life?
Obnoxious. Yeah, why not? Yeah, that's definitely what we do. No, I mean, it is the case that, as you say, we all have, especially now, had to develop a certain relationship with our phones, with social media, and celebrate that to an extent that it maintains links with a world beyond our kind of direct proximities. But that can also be, in the most grievous way, as Caleb was mentioning, actually very anxiety producing, and feel more like you're locked into something that's a trap or a kind of void, rather than something that's used for joy or for communication, or for expression either of anger or upset or ecstasy. So it is weird to read it now in perhaps a new context, and also I guess it's weird to read in the most kind of unprofound way, to think that walruses will still be doing what they're doing, with no one there to really monitor them. It kind of it has an absurdity to it, as a theme and as a topic that I think has a new light for me, or has a new resonance, perhaps.
Mm. Yes, well, let's hope the walruses continue in the light of that's a whole other crisis we're not going to go into. Lucy, I know that you knew this story before it appeared on when we were judging for the shortlist, and had loved it from before, and we both read quite a lot of very short fiction, and this really, really impressed us, because it does what so many stories fail to do in kind of expanding that vision beyond just a tiny moment. What did you really love about it?
I think some of the best short story writers, like Lydia Davis, like George Saunders, their stories, they do have to be much, much bigger than the length of words that they have. And I think that, Eley, maybe you get the same with teaching. I know that a lot of my students are very interested in flash fiction. There's something about the intensity of that form. And I've just seen over and over how very hard it is to write. But I think not only does that story do that, but when you said that this time of year always makes you think of going to Charleston, this time of year always makes me think of Louis MacNeice. And one of my favourite poems, Autumn Journal, written sort of late 30s, just before war. It's an account of that autumn. It feels incredibly fresh, incredibly modern, contemporary, because he packs it full of things and stuff, and, you know, from newspapers and rubbish and words and phrases overheard, and it's just full of the stuff of everyday life. And what I loved about Eley's story is, you know, the ... of the phone. That is how we live now. I have a story in my now much delayed but coming out next year collection, and it's basically all about WhatsApp. You know, the way that you send a message and it's only got one single grey tick, and then you wait for the ticks to go grey, which means it has been delivered, so someone could theoretically have seen it. But the moment at which they choose to make it go blue, or the way that you can see if someone's online, you can see if someone's typing, if that typing goes away, exactly all of these concerns that Eley's story has. And I think that, I know that if Chekhov was alive and writing today, he would be writing about the phones and the ... and the distance and the longing, and it's all the same feelings, but finding the very precisely contemporary ways to articulate those. You know, I think that with a short story, the form matters as much as the content, and thinking about how we convey and articulate the precise experience of how we live now. I think Eley's story is one of the best examples of that I've read recently, and so that was another of the things that I loved about it.
It's, I mean, that very short fiction is something you've absolutely specialised in, Eley, isn't it? I mean, Atrib and other stories, they're very short. Why do you like it so much? What does it give you?
I find that it's a way of both delivering a short, sharp shock. I think that has its own tension, that maybe the lack of plot that somehow dogs my writing, that plot is not necessarily of the highest priority to me as a writer of short fiction, and that again that can be a failure on the part of a writer. But I hope that with my stories I am more interested in characterization and tone, and how characters undergo a kind of brief process and realization, and there's tension there, there's a kind of universe of feeling that can be expressed there. But I find also that again, maybe this is, I'm using this interview as a kind of therapy, but that especially in the current moment, my attention is all over the place. I'm finding it very difficult to maintain concentration in a wholesome and generous way over long form, and that maybe as a writer that is reflected in wanting to claim attention quickly. But for that attention, once claimed, to have resonance, to maybe have ignited something, rather than being forensic and illustrative in a longer form. But no, I think I am drawn to shorter fiction, and certainly flash fiction when I read it, when it is, as you say, Lucy, kind of George Saunders, his work just in sometimes 700 words just feels like it's become part of your anatomy, because you recognize it and you kind of thrum to what it's doing with rhythm. And it's interesting you mention Louis MacNeice, because often it is poetical and metrical conceits that often can be applied to short stories in a way that don't feel like contrivance or gimmickry. I think that the fact that a sentence or even a well-chosen word can be the spur, or as I say, an ignition for a short story. I think there is much to be learned from the poets there, and much to be valued in short stories that I value.
Sometimes I think that with a novel, you have all this cantilevering and all of this stuff and all of this plot in order for one or two moments. And what I love most about short stories is when they work, you dispense with all of that. You don't need any of that build-up. You don't need any of that scaffolding. You just have that intensity of that moment.
And I think that may be one reason, because I think what you're saying, Eley, about the difficulties of reading and focusing and keeping concentration on long novels at the moment is really hard. And that's a recurring theme in a lot of the programs I've been making this summer, is people saying that concentration is really difficult. And I think that's one of the ways that short stories are speaking in all their different forms to us. I also think that the crossover between poetry and short stories, we saw it with Jack Houston's story Come Down Heavy, and the final story on the shortlist that we haven't yet discussed at all. But I mean, that's an exercise partly in a sort of poetic prose form that comes through and is daring and brilliantly done, I think. And perhaps there's a more comfortable feeling that you can cross these borders now as short story writers, and there's something, it's both more precise but also freer than it has been. I don't know if you both feel that or if all three of you feel that as writers now. Caleb, because you use as, you know, the opening of Prey is in a sense a piece of poetry too.
Yeah, I definitely feel like I owe a lot of my prose writing to poets. Just the kind of precision and the brevity in which they can hone in on these singular moments, and deliver just something like quite special within a sentence or a couple of words, or a short turn of a phrase. And I think, yeah, like I really enjoy thinking about what different forms can be like. So what a novel could be like, or what a short story could be like, and how we can you know take whatever feeling we're trying to communicate and express and find the correct form for it. And you know, if that comes in 2,000 words of singular sentences, then that might be a short story, or it might be a poem. But it just depends on what form suits what you're writing and what feeling you're trying to express. Yeah, so I definitely feel like I like straddle various forms in trying to express whatever feeling I am having or like trying to put across.
Is that the same for you, Eley?
Yeah, I think so. I also value that kind of hybrid forms are now having more light in the sun. People have always been writing in those forms, but phrases, kind of generic markers like prose poetry, like flash fiction, I think are now being seen as something that can be championed rather than something that can be seen as not quite one thing and not quite another. And I think that's all to the good. I think that's, as a reader, something that I really value, the kind of slipperiness that can be allowed of form and can be so effective of form. It's not that something's failing to be one thing or another. It's, as you say, Caleb, that a choice has been made and that the language that's being used is right for that feeling and for the way in which information and themes and verve can be communicated in the best way.
Yeah, and I think we need that sort of level of energy, verve, I agree, and the appropriate response to incredibly changing and difficult times all the time. I mean, I'm interested to know whether, I mean, I know obviously your novel's been out this year, Eley, and Caleb, you've got yours coming out next year, and you know, Lucy, you're sort of multi-faceted in terms of writing. I wondered finally, because we're drawing near the end of our time now, where you feel the short story will, in whatever form you choose to embrace it, will sit within your kind of canon as a writer, if you like. I mean, will you be blown away by the excitement of novels and not want to come back to these, or will they always be part of your heartland? Eley, do you want to start?
Yeah, I feel that I found writing a novel more difficult than writing a short story. I think that might be because of habit, and that I can't see that I would ever stop writing short fiction. In writing the novel, it felt so different from, you know, I'll just write 26 short stories and find a way to stitch them together. Yeah, that's it. I felt that with short stories suit some of my interests in a way that a novel suited. I'm blurbling as I do it. Maybe I'm better at blurts and blurbs than I am at longer form architecture. No, I can't see myself stopping writing short stories.
And Lucy?
I found my form with the short story. I love short stories. I think they're the most difficult. They're the most satisfying. They're the most magical. They're the most elusive forms. And I've published one collection now. One was meant to be out this year, but was delayed for a whole year. What I find a bit frustrating is that publishers are far more interested in a novel than a collection of short stories. There's only one prize in the whole of the UK and Ireland for a collection of short stories. I don't see why collections of short stories shouldn't be eligible for the Booker Prize and for the bigger prizes. I feel that they are under-celebrated. I think that it takes something. I really felt that in Ireland, Kevin Barry just blew the form open, what he could do in 2006, still so recent with his collection. And The Stinging Fly really led the way for journals and magazines, really set the standard. And there are so many brilliant outlets for short fiction in Ireland particularly. I think you did brilliant things with the award, because there aren't, been lucky enough to have several commissions from Radio 4. I write quite naturally that 2,000 word slot I've done. There aren't so many outlets. The story isn't so much celebrated, but yet as a writer, you gain from everything other people have done. You see other people's work and what they've managed to do, and as a writer, you're always a beneficiary of that. It makes you raise your bar higher, set your standard higher, feel yourself in dialogue and conversation. I think readers, writers as well, will look at the range of stories we have across the award this year, and I think it will feel really exciting. I hope it feels inspiring. I hope it makes them feel that many more things are possible.
And Caleb, for you?
I think for myself, it's the reverse, Ellie. Like, I definitely found writing a novel easier than writing a short story. But I'm like so intrigued by the short story, by the challenge that a short story presents. And it kind of, there is something that really sits with me as both a writer and as a visual artist, because there's a relation to a photograph which I really, just that moment of kind of like, it, for me, writing a short story is almost like photographing lightning. Like, it's like it comes down and you're trying to capture these like shards of electricity like flowing through like celluloid. And so yeah, like short stories they're integral to my work, and I think both Lucy and Ellie, like, you have really influenced my work, and I don't think I would have written Prey if I hadn't read your work previously. So it's really lovely to kind of be in this forum amongst you guys. But yeah, I definitely think that Prey is the short story that I'm most proud of, and perhaps, as you say, that like my first short story. And I'm just intrigued as to what I can do with the form going forward.
I love that image of a shaft of lightning going through, and I really, really hope you will. I hope you're all going to keep writing short stories, because I do think they offer us something, especially, well, not especially, but not least in these times, which is important and reflective and immediate, and that's going to be very important. I don't know if you have any tips for next year's aspiring writers for this competition, who might be thinking about writing about the Corona times. I think that will be quite a difficult thing to get right myself, but and perhaps one should try and explore at a slant, because I think the best stories come at a slant at life, don't they? And it's been a complete pleasure to talk to you all. I think we're probably just about out of time now. But I really hope you'll all keep writing. I hope everybody watching this will seek out your stories and read them, and the novels, and keep following what you do. We've got great news, because Cambridge University have confirmed another 3 years of partnership. So the award goes on. So we'll be back next year, hopefully in person at Charleston, and that will be lovely. Meantime, this is the last event from Small Wonder for this year, but all the events are available online till midnight, I think, tonight. And so please do check them out if you can. And I wanted to say a special thank you to all the audience at Charleston who've supported us over all these years, to all the judges, to all the writers who've entered for 15 years. You can hear all the stories on BBC Sounds. You can read them in the Comma Press anthology, which has got the most fantastic picture of walruses in neon pink on the cover, in tribute to Eley's lovely walruses, which I won't look at in the same way. And most of all, I want to say thank you to all of you. Thank you very much to Lucy Caldwell, Caleb Azumah Nelson, and Eley Williams, and congratulations on being shortlisted in a particularly fine and special year. Lovely to be with you all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.